everyone. I'm so excited to have you here on another episode of Right Off Track. With me, I have an amazing guest who is Sarah Hunt, and I have had personally the pleasure of working with her in my former days at Meta, and it's been so amazing to see her growth and where life has taken her. So I'm excited to talk about her journey and learn from her, but a little bit more professional background about her. She is on a mission to build thriving organizations where people bring their full emotional and cognitive resources to meet the complex challenges of our time. Across the last 15 years, because she started at 5, she's driven scaled people development initiatives and transformations across a wide range of Fortune 500 companies, including some of the top technology companies globally. She's interested in moving beyond individual learning paths to building systems to support employees to thrive holistically. And she's also based out of the Bay Area, so if you're there, say hi. She's originally from Australia, so looking forward to hearing about her story coming here. And recently she completed her executive master's in change leadership and org psychology from Columbia University, which is a pretty amazing deal. So congrats there, Sarah. So excited to have you here and talk about all those experiences. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Anya. That's very nice. It's always a strange thing when someone reads out your biography back to you. So I really appreciate that. It's great to see you again. And it's just wonderful to be able to have this conversation. I'm just excited.
Thank you. I'm excited as well. You know, when I started this, I was thinking about who can I connect with who's on this learning path, who's somebody who inspires me with just the way they approach not life and work in a way that's wholesome and meaningful and always challenging themselves to grow. And you were somebody that came to mind. So I'm excited that you can share your learnings with us. And also, I'm so impressed with like your continued way to keep growing. Like you mentioned, you've already been working in top tech companies. So I'd love to maybe start off with like, hey, you're already where you probably many people want to be. Where did you find this passion, desire to like keep doing something new and explore this path towards a master's in this particular education path?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And thank you for asking it. It's really curious because I think sometimes, and certainly I would have said maybe 8 or 10 years ago in my career, I was certainly looking to achieve success in some of those conventional ways, right? And I think it might mean working at a company or a particular firm, or starting your own venture, whatever that is, right? Those conventional kind of external pieces that we look to that really help us define kind of our progress, whether that's getting a degree or all of these things, right? And I think they're really useful and helpful goals. But I think among that and kind of within that, there's also this deeper question that we kind of ask ourselves on our career of what is this deeper journey I'm on? What is the deeper problem I'm solving? And that really goes beyond an individual role or an individual, job or project that you might have. And I think for me, something I kind of alluded to in and you shared in that introduction is really for me across the course of my career, I've started to become really interested in this idea of how do we build ecosystems and environments? And this is in this case in the company context, but it could be really in any kind of professional environment where people are able to really thrive and do their best work. And I think there's so many different variables that go into that. And so I think the common thread across the course of my career has been the pursuit of that question. And so I think sometimes, we think about, what's the role progression, or am I, becoming more senior, or, what's the attractive thing that I'm, getting in that next step in my career. But actually for me, a lot of what is driving those decisions is that kind of pursuit of that deeper question of being in service to that bigger concept, I think, in the work that I do.
Amazing. And so you're growing, you're pursuing that path. And where did the decision come? Like, hey, you know what would be helpful in this is getting that master's degree and doing it in this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I've always had such a real, sense of wonderment at people who might get their master's degree, quite early in their career or maybe even in their 20s. I know some people do that. And I've always had a sense of admiration for that because I came out of university and I thought, I have no idea where do I want to go. I don't know what my experience is. I really had no sense of direction. And so for me, the idea of taking a master's program, that's usually for me something you would do when you found that clear or that clarity in your calling. And I hadn't found that. So it took me a long time to get to that master's program. But I think if I backtrack, for me, when I started out in my career, I was working a lot in communications. So a lot of my earlier, training was in that area. And for me, I was very interested in how we communicate effectively with others to make change, right? And I was thinking about that, in working in journalism and helping people kind of, teach good writing and really kind of those very effective tactics to help people kind of make change and connect with each other effectively. But as I was going through that, I started to realize that actually without the self development, without the deeper self awareness, a lot of that communication is largely ineffective. And so we can kind of teach people these external tools, but without really having self awareness to direct your behavior in positive ways, that doesn't really, it's not as effective as it could be. And so that kind of led me to a lot of the emotional intelligence work I've done in my career and working at a company called Search Inside Yourself Global, which is really one of the leading emotional intelligence companies in the world. And as I was in that part of my career, I was really interested in how those skills function in the workplace. But what I started to see was that actually, even though emotional intelligence is a fantastic tool set, and I still very much believe in it wholeheartedly, without the kind of, I would say, systems wrapper around the individual experience. So without that sense of support, without that sense of like being in an organization that really is supporting you to thrive and so on, you can do as much emotional intelligence as you like as an individual, but it can, in some ways, can only take you so far.
Right.
And so I really wanted to understand how to transform entire ecosystems inside companies, so that people could really do their best work. And that's what brought me to ultimately the degree, which was the main focus of that.
That's awesome. And Sarah, I found you at Search Inside Yourself, that training. And to me, I think I got there because there was a point in my career where I realized I have a lot of things, and we talked about that. We're very grateful for things you can accomplish. But if you're achieving all of that, and maybe you have everything you think you should be, happy about your family and all the health and the good house, all that, not to take it that way, but you're still stressed all the time, right? And
Right.
there's got to be another way. And that's was like where the mindfulness and search inside yourself helped me. But to your point, there's also the environmental issues, right? That are within your company, or maybe we can talk about also externally, that affect how we see ourselves, how successful we can be, right? Especially if in a corporate culture. So I'm curious, can you tell us a little more like after your degree now, like what is your focus? Where are you taking that? Like where's your passion driving you? What problems are you solving?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I think that's a question that I've had from a number of people. It's funny, because I finished the degree quite recently, and it's one of those feelings that you get when, I don't know if you've ever, done like a long race or a marathon or something, and you get to the marathon and the end of the marathon, and then people say, when will you run the next one? And what's your next marathon? And I don't have the exact answer to that yet. I think, for me, there's a couple of things that I think about. So when I think about change and transformation in an organization, a lot of my work in the last couple of years in particular has really been focused on this concept of scale. And I think scale is really interesting as it relates to change, because you and I know in the companies that we've worked in, we're in unique positions where we can kind of do things that may touch thousands or even millions of people in some cases, in terms of how we can scale. And so I think it's a really interesting question to look at how you make scale change within complex systems. And particularly for me, a lot of my focus is on learning. A lot of my focus is on employee design and things like that. So that's a really interesting question for me. And I think as that progresses, I'm always trying to balance this tension between how do you scale something across a large group, and how do you not lose that depthful quality that we get when we meet each other meaningfully in connected spaces, right? And I think this is such a question that many of us are asking, as we've moved to a lot of hybrid remote work conditions, as we're trying to kind of build more connected communities. I think there's a lot of fracturing of community connection as a result of the pandemic. And so I think there's this constant tension of trying to find ways that we can reach as many people as possible, but also make sure that there's that depthful piece with the learning that exists at the same time. So that's a kind of an exploration for me at the moment. And I'm never sure which one is winning out for me, because I love one-on-one. I love being close to people. I love connection. I love facilitation. And yet at the same time, the complexity of scale is such an interesting problem to solve as well. So I don't have my packaged answer yet, unfortunately.
Well, would you entertain me in diving into some of that? So I want to maybe start at the global, not global, let's say company scale, right? And then maybe take some of those learnings and talk about how can a person having that your knowledge make like be more effective within the whole, right? So it's thinking about like here's the company problem, how we're solving, and then how can an individual knowing that be more be able to like have their agency and kind of reinforce the positive things that you're doing as a whole. To back to draw all the back on the company scale, what are like some big issues? You mentioned the issue of being remote, working remotely. I know you and I talked about in the prep call about the sense of isolation that's also happening when you're working remote, or even like right now when a lot of people are facing like on a massive scale issues like being laid off, right? And there's a sense of some of those isolation around there. Like, what are some of the big challenges you think corporations are having, and like how can we start thinking about them, or how can corporations think about addressing those?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think I can certainly answer that from the lens of the areas that I know well in terms of supporting employees in as they're making as they're going on learning journeys of different sorts and varying sorts. And I think that's an area that I know really well. I think some of the areas of complexity that I see. One is that I find really interesting, particularly when we're working at scale and in a global context, is how do we build out learning experiences that both acknowledge the humanity and uniqueness of each individual, but then also, as well, are really rooted in the appropriate cultural context in which they might be learning or experiencing things. One of the things, in moving to the US in particular, I think, the companies that I've worked at are centered in the US. And so it's often this kind of hub and spoke model. So, it's the hub is here, and then we're kind of expanding outwards from there, right? And so sometimes that can be effective as a means to bring about scale and change. And then other times, what you're looking for is a much more networked model where you want to actually provide, different locations and different sites and different, cultural contexts and company contexts, right? The ability to really effectively make decisions about change their employees, centered within their own context. And so I think a lot of what I see can be these kind of hub and spoke type change models that I think really can sometimes disempower folks who are not necessarily in that hub of change, so to speak. So that's something I think about a lot. I also think too, in some ways with this kind of increase in disconnection and remote working, like what you're talking about, it paradoxically, I think, requires us to actually connect more with each other than we may have otherwise done, right? And I think there's been a lot said about this, but it requires us to connect a lot more intentionally with folks in ways that previously the system of the workplace would have supported us to do that. So we kind of use these classic examples, like you and I probably would have run into each other in the hallway in previous times, and we would have had this kind of wonderful conversation, probably in a hallway somewhere at some company, or we would have done that, but we didn't. And so we have to continually and intentionally and deliberately make these choices to connect. And I actually think that's quite hard, because it puts a cognitive load and an onus on the individual to be making those types of choices and reaching out continuously. And so for me, a lot of what I've become really interested in the past few years is building up networks and communities with folks that are both global, that cut across workplace lines. I think we've talked about this, in relation to a lot of the layoffs that have happened. You kind of have this whole workplace and ecosystem and identity, and then suddenly you don't,
Right.
And where's the network? Where's the community? And so I think for me, increasingly, professional communities of interest have been things that I really want to proactively cultivate, that help people move beyond their identity as just an employee of a particular company or organization.
And so let's dive into that. I'm really curious because it's hard, right? You may have a good intention, like I'm going to put together, like connect all these amazing people. It's going to be so great. I have this cool idea. You get on, you create your little blog or whatever. You post your little comment, and then crickets. And you're like, but I have this amazing idea. Like people, like I want to help you. So if you're starting something or like a business or somebody who's just trying to start and like build the right foundation around this knowledge, like do you have any advice about how do we build community? Are there any foundational steps that can lay the ground for more effective kind of community, whether it be virtual or on site or a mix of those in this reality, so that way you're kind of not preventing the problems, right, but you're helping yourself be as successful as possible to hit the ground running there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's so interesting because I have such an enormous respect for people like yourself who are entrepreneurs, who are self-starters, because I know for myself, I am not a self-starter. I'm a network starter. So if there's a group, I'm 100% going to start something with that group. But on my own, I really am. It's hard. That's a hard thing for me. And I think, um, yeah, I just have such enormous respect for people who can do that. But for me, one of the things I've noticed in my career journey, which has always been counterintuitive, is I think my thinking style is I tend to be quite out there and quite divergent in my thinking. So I'm often like thinking of the most extreme idea,
I love it.
right?
I love
You
it.
know, and what I've found over time is that it's really about preferencing the ideas that are shared with me by a number of others. So I may have my own little idea of what I think is going to make a great community or where I think things need to go. And sometimes I think those ideas are valid and fantastic.
Yeah.
But often what I start to index on a lot more is the ideas that really spark interest in others. So it's that development of followership or even relationship, I would say, that feels crucial to me to the viability of a community. So just because I think an idea is great or I think it's my big the big revelation I'm having, it's not necessarily going to be what others are going to coalesce around. And so when I think about some of the networks I'm in and things that I've grown over time or communities that I've grown over time, it's always been about what is it that we're excited by as a group. What is it that if it's five of us or even it's three of us or it's 100 or 1,000 of us, what are we as a group collectively excited about? And so I think that's often my starting point is thinking about that and then growing from there, for me.
I love that. And I think that can apply to anybody, entrepreneur, business owner, like your friends, and you're like, I just want them to get them on the idea. Can you maybe talk us through like how do you do that pulse check? I think there's also sort of like where maybe you are in the room and you're like, okay, I think I am thinking about other people. I think they're gonna get on board with this. But then again, you have crickets, right? Or you maybe get like one or two people. How do you continue that from starting point to actually seeing progress? Like, do you persevere? Do you get feedback? Is there anything that's worked for you to kind of follow through on that?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. This is such a great topic, Anya, because I think it does refer a lot as well to, well, a couple of things come to mind. One is leadership style. So I think some people have a very, very kind of hard charging, forward motion leadership style. So they'll say, I'm going to go out here. I'm going to do this thing. If one person follows me, or 100 or 1,000, I don't, I'm charging off into the distance. I think my leadership style tends to be very very kind of collaboratively forward. So I tend to be kind of, it's a tortoise and a hare moment. I think I tend to be that tortoise who's kind of perhaps moving at a slower pace but is constantly kind of checking in with others around, are they keen, are they moving forward, are we together as a group. And so I think when we think about, are the ideas working, or am I getting crickets, to kind of use your your analogy there. I think I've had a lot of failure. I think there's a lot of failure inherent in any kind of development of any idea or group or leadership or initiative. There's a lot of failure, and I think these little micro failures when I was earlier in my career would really hurt. They'd really sting, right? Because we want success. We want people to kind of give us that validation and that feedback and that what we're doing is right. Um, but what I've actually found is that over time, I've tended to move as quickly as I can through those micro failures. So with each micro failure, I kind of treat it as an experiment. And when you run an experiment, it fails, you just move on from it. And I think that's a really common approach that I see a lot of people who have been, successful in various ways taking. And that was something I had to learn, and it took me quite some time to get good at that. Because I know, and particularly I think this is true for folks who are working in these big companies. It attracts the A-type personality, it attracts the hard worker, it attracts the let's say the nerdy student, right? The person who's done really well, right? Let's be real, and so I think this idea of experiencing failure repeatedly is quite uncommon, or it feels quite perhaps alien even for folks who are initiating new things. So that's been a learning journey for me for sure.
Mine too. What I find valuable about school and what I talk about is like I think that the off track in this whole thing is that everybody has their own unique path. And I wanted to share that it can be very different. It could be doing education, right? It could be starting your own thing. But the main thing that I've learned from my academic and personal part is that when you focus on learning, there's always going to be that discomfort, right? No matter what it is, even if it's like for me, my two children screaming at me and I'm like, okay, I gotta get through this, right? But every time you learn that you can do it, right? And that develops that certain little level of resilience and confidence that I can do something more that I didn't know or that I could do earlier. And that's what I think is interesting. Like as we learn that it's not just about what you're learning at hand. It's developing that resilience to say, I can do more. And it expands your possibilities because you develop that little bit of confidence.
Oh, yes. I so agree with that. I so agree with that. I mean, I think I've certainly noticed in my career that my resiliency has gone up as I've gone through my career. Because I think what you develop over time is what I call for myself kind of stories of success. And so in my mind, sometimes when something goes wrong, you have this counterweight of all these other examples where you're like, oh, actually, but that did go well previously. Or, you know what, I'm trying this now, but maybe I'll try that other thing that I tried before. So I think you're kind of, as you move through and you go through that learning journey, it builds up a bank of resilience within yourself. Like, right. And we can talk a lot about that idea of self-compassion. Like, what is the story that you're telling yourself about what this particular failure might mean, or, what this difficult moment might mean? And so in some ways, I think, interestingly, I've found that things have gotten easier over time, even though they're not easier. It's not actually easier, but my relationship to the things that I'm doing, to my sense of self, has really improved as I've gone through my career. And so I can take more risks and experience more failure, but it doesn't affect me in the same way as it used to earlier on.
And I know we talked about this on the prep call, so I hope it's not too much. But I want to talk about the failure, right? And I want to talk about your off track moments because I do think that it's important to tell people about things that didn't just go well. Like they see you and you're accomplished and you're doing all this and you got your Columbia degree, which is amazing. Not to take anything away from it. But I think there's a key story behind that. And it's important to show that like you started and you had your failures and your off track moments and you got through that, which is why you are here and who you are. Do you mind sharing a little bit about things that you feel comfortable sharing if you're off track?
Oh, yeah. I love talking about being off track. So this is it's such a great topic. Yeah, and I'm really passionate about that as well. I'm really passionate about the idea of taking our own moments, and I think when I hear you say off track, I think sometimes we think about that as off track perhaps of the expectations that we might have within the society or the community that we live in, right? So what does it mean to transgress those? What does it mean to make decisions that others might think, oh, what are you doing there, like not sure about that, right? So sometimes I think it's the feeling that in relationship to others we're making decisions that others may think or be concerned about in terms of where we are. So that's how I'm hearing you kind of when we think about that. and and I think it's important not to discount that, because in life it's so important to have people around you, I think, that support you in where you're at. And so, to give you some concrete examples of my own journey, I think I was off track for, in the technical sense of that, for a very long time, for a very, very long time. In fact, I think so much of what has made me able to work well in the career that I'm in now, and to kind of pursue this education, and some of the work that I've done, is because I was so off track for so long. I think I've spent so many years, particularly in my 20s, you know really, and this is very much a function of being Australian, so I have to kind of acknowledge the country that I grew up in, that kind of facilitates this. But I spent a lot of my 20s traveling all over the world, living all over the world, not really working in the traditional sense a lot, doing a lot of self-development. I spent a lot of time learning about who I am in a variety of different situations, doing all sorts of different projects. And I was doing uh, you know volunteer work as well, and living in different places. And so I think, for me, there was at that time an incredible need to understand, who am I at a deeper level, right? Who am I if all of these things are not there, all of the whatever, the jobs, the degrees, if you don't have any of those things, who am I? What's the me that's there? And that's where I started my journey in my 20s, because I felt very lost as a person. I didn't feel that initial drive to obtain those types of things that people traditionally do. And I take nothing from people who do that. I think it's great. But I didn't. I really needed to know who I was. And so, one of the things I did, when I was in my late 20s, I left Australia. I was in a job there, and I left Australia, and I traveled around the world for about a year. And I met my husband on a trip there. We were in Nepal, actually, hiking. We met there, and we hitchhiked across Europe together. We did from all the way from Spain to to the Czech Republic in hitchhiking, which was really fun. And then we ended up moving together to the Bay Area, and to kind of, essentially, with a vision, with a dream, that we could live a different type of life, have a different type of career together. And I wanted to make this transition into emotional intelligence. And I came to the States. I didn't know anyone. I had no network. I didn't have a job. And that year was probably the hardest year I can remember. Not having any network, really starting from scratch. Also, in a completely different culture. The States has its own very unique way of doing things, and the US has its own way of thinking, and people have their own ways of approaching things here. And so, yeah, that was incredibly difficult. And I think the migration journey is really hard for a lot of people, for different reasons. And so it took a lot of scrappiness for me, a lot of like volunteering and doing kind of consulting and little assignments and all of that, to slowly build up that momentum and that change in my career. And I think, to speak to the emotional piece, a lot of very difficult moments of experiencing failure, of not experiencing a lot of validation, and so I look back on all of that now, and a lot of what I face now feels relatively quite easy, because there was so much of that challenge and difficulty in those various phases earlier on.
Pardon, a little bit of water going on. That is such a beautiful story, and it's so powerful, because I think we just have to try to not talk about our failures, especially talk about in society. Like, everything is perfect. I'm so happy. I'm so successful. Everything is good, and I think it makes it really hard on the inside when you're off the screen to then say, well, why am I struggling then? Like, am I the only one? Is anybody else having this self-doubt? Especially when you're trying something new and you're going for growth. And it's like, well, I can just comfortably be where I'm at, but it doesn't feel right. But nobody else is like, nobody's talking about the discomfort when they're doing something. It's just, they're always like, oh, I'm already there. So thank you for
Absolutely.
sharing. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. I think, I think it's so important to talk about. One of the things I'm super passionate about is sharing on success and joy, and really leaning into that, but also equally leaning into and talking honestly and openly about struggle, challenge, difficulty. I think a lot of my work in some of my previous roles really did focus on areas of emotional intelligence that touched things like mental health, well-being, these areas of selfhood that are, I think, so critical to our functioning. And I certainly know, certainly in, I think, the society here, particularly in the US, I think there is a really strong cultural element here of about presenting for success. And it's interesting because it's a two-edged thing. I
Yeah.
think it's so exciting and wonderful to be able to really strive and thrive here. And I think that's why so many people are attracted to living in the US. The kind of the culture here of high achievement, of really going for it, is fantastic. But I think the flip side of that is when you are in struggle, when you are having challenge, it's so hard to feel necessarily a sense of community and connectedness around that, but
Yeah.
it's so vital in order to be able to, I think, go through those difficult moments and those difficult times.
And do you mind if we use that as a pivot towards, we talked about layoffs and we talked about sharing a little bit more what we can, our experience and any suggestions to people who are facing this difficult time. Is there anything like that you would recommend for people with your change management, change leadership experience, or your corporate experience from your own time coming to this new country, starting fresh? Like, what would you recommend people who may be feeling like isolated, lost right now, maybe even like lacking that confidence because it feels
Mm.
like again, part of their identity might have changed because of this? Anything you would share with people right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm imagining the person who is listening to this now and I'm wanting to address them directly, I think I would say, you know, you're not alone. You're not alone. And I think for more than anything, I think that's the most important message, is to understand that our circumstances don't define who we are as people, right? Maybe that person who's gone through that layoff is in a moment of challenge, is in a moment of questioning about, who am I now? Who am I now? What is my purpose? Maybe there's even these base concerns of, can I afford, my basic needs now as a result of that, right? With looking out into, a pretty challenging economy. So I think it's the acknowledgement of your humanity, the importance of taking care of yourself. I think the importance of, really, really finding the network that is going to support you and see you for who you are. And I think that's crucial at any stage in life. Beyond, even when we're riding high, we still need those networks, right? But especially then. And I think when I first came here to the States, I think the way that I built out my earlier wins was by finding ways to experience those small wins in each day. And I think for me, not everyone responds like this, but for me, that was a really, really helpful tool. So it's the wins that don't index on outcomes. So for example, right, if you're like, well, you know what, I need to find another job. That's really important right now for XYZ reasons. Then it's okay, gee, wow, if I can do, five, applications a week that are really high quality, that are really great, that's a win. It's
Yeah.
not how many callbacks you get, it's that you did it. It's that you took those steps, you ran those experiments. That's the win. That's the thing that you get to feel good about. My husband and I, we have this debate all the time about effort versus result,
Yeah.
right? And I do think that results are important, but I think acknowledging the win of the effort, right? Of, okay, this week I'm going to go to one gathering of people, right? This week I'm going to do one networking call. Um, Even the indexing of the win as the effort, to me, is so important for that sense of well-being. That's something for me that was really, really a crucial reframing
Yeah.
to, oh, I only get to feel good when I get the result.
Absolutely. And to add to that, and I love the idea of not focusing so much on the goal because I think people, it becomes a habit to where like it's never enough, right? That you're waiting for to live later when that goal is achieved, but you're like in your head, you're like later, later, later. And then you get there and you're like, well, what's the next thing? And then, okay, later, 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 what's the next thing? So I hear that even when it's challenging, right? Like, what can you control in the moment? Like the balance between like the worry of later. Yes, it's there, but also acknowledging, okay, what can I do now? And if it's not under control, then I have to let some of that energy go because it's just drowning me a little bit. But to people specifically, because I want to also just offer my insight, I think that community and you're not alone is a very powerful message. And so many people want to help. Like so many people relate to that. I hear about them, like I want to offer. And I think the challenge is A, how to stand out among the noise, right? And B is also use that, like reach out to people who are offering help and say, I need help and be very specific. Right? It's like, can you help refer me? Can you look at my resume? So like those are the two things. A, reach out and then be very specific what you want to get help with. Do you have any suggestions to add to that? Anything, any words of wisdom?
Yeah, you know, I love that. I mean, I think there's two levels, right? And what I'm hearing is these great examples of what I would call kind of tactical help, right? So, and then we need so I think when we think about our network, we can think about it in various ways, right? So I think we have folks we may have a tactical relationship with, so that that person who's they've got the network, they can make the introduction, right? That's really helpful. But I also think too, at least in my experience, there's a piece there as well around who in your network is going to be your cheerleader, who's going to be your champion, who's going to be that person that maybe you're reaching out to them for a call and it's actually not about what they can do for you or what they can get for you, but actually it's just someone you really admire, who sees you, who values you, and they're going to be that emotional support person to you. They're going to be the person who might give you that sense of remembering who you are, of knowing who you are. And those are really valuable connections as well. And so I think it's not sometimes, you know, in networking, we can think of it in a really transactional way. So like, oh, well, I'll reach out if that, you know, if I have something I can give or they have something they can give. But I also think it's super important to be continually cultivating relationships that are inherently valuable for their own sake. Because I think that's, you know, for me, certainly that's been one of the deepest joys. And it can be hard to do that when you're in a situation where you do really have a big need. So say you're looking for a job and you're like, wow, that's really feels very number one right now. That's very pressing. But building those relationships in an ongoing long-term capacity can really pay off dividends, I think, in the long term too.
Yeah.
So for me, it's both. It's both that tactical. It's also both that kind of deeply, relational and kind of emotional connection as well.
I was laughing because I was thinking, well, maybe you decide to start a podcast and you're like, who do I know?
Right, exactly, right, exactly. You know, we don't always know where our network is going to take us, and oftentimes, you know, I think some of the most interesting opportunities for me have come about because I've just built relationships with people I find interesting, I find valuable. There's not a strong agenda there necessarily for me. And then down the line, suddenly something will align with that person, or there'll be a moment, and you think, "Gosh, yeah, you know what? Actually, X, Y, and Z." I think one other thing I would say too is I do know that when we're in a situation of challenge, sometimes what can happen, and this has been my experience, is we can feel a little, there's that sense of, inwardly of kind of focusing on the challenge that we're facing, right? So we might come to a call and think, gosh, I really just need this person to, do this for me, or whatever. And I think sometimes when we're in that mind space, we can actually miss the value that we still bring to the other person. So I also think even if you're in a situation where you're, having a layoff, or making some sort of transition, I always think it's really important to think too about what value you're bringing to that relationship as well, rather than necessarily just focusing on your own situation and what you need from that person. Because I think it's can be a real positive kind of boost to one's sense of self to think, you know what, yeah, I have a lot I can offer, and to make sure that relationship is as bi-directional as possible.
You know what's funny to add to that? I had when I was interviewing not long ago, I had a sticky note that says, I have a lot to offer. And it was just on my desktop and I put it right there so I can look at it, because sometimes just like that little reminder is so helpful. So if you need a little boost, just write a sticky note, whatever makes you feel good, or I have a lot to offer, and add that to where you can see it. So you just have a good reminder.
Totally. I love that. I mean, I think it's, one of the things that I think is often not spoken about, but is a real dynamic is, I think particularly when we're looking for roles, and if, say, for example, you've been out of work for a while, or there's, financial pressure, other types of things, there can be a real feeling of power asymmetry in the relationship, right? So you're meeting with someone who's a prospective employer, sometimes there can be that tendency to kind of, agree to everything, or kind of throw you, maybe you had a list of your ideal role and you kind of throw that out the window, and oh yeah, I'll do anything. Yeah, whatever you think, right? That's great. Yeah, sure, that salary sounds fine,
Right. Right.
right? And so I can understand how that can happen. And I think it's sometimes it's necessary, because we might be in a situation where that is like a temporary solution. Like, yeah, I will take this role that's a level below where I thought I'd want to be, or
Right.
maybe those are needed decisions. But at the same time, it's always really important to remember your point. I have a lot to offer. I have a lot to offer. And I think holding that in mind is really important in that search process.
And just to add to that, and I want to also give you space to focus on anything that I didn't cover yet that you're passionate about, because I know I want to be respectful of your time, and we went to so many awesome things, but I also want to make sure I didn't miss anything. But one thing to add to that is, again, if you are, that's how I'm thinking personally. Like, if I have to find something that maybe lowers my pay, which is okay, right? Because I think the things that I value are still going to be there. Like, my family is still going to be there. Like, sure, worst case scenario, honestly, like, being real talk, maybe we have to sell our house. Like, and I get that. Like, that's something I thought about. It could happen. But my family is still going to be there. They're still going to be healthy. Like, those things are still going to be there. And that's what matters to me. So I'm like, okay, like, that may happen. We'll figure out. But as I'm looking for next opportunity, I'm thinking, well, how can I still grow? Even if it's like a salary cut or something, like, but what opportunity, or maybe it's like, hey, I'm doing something, but I know it's not going to take up all my time. So it can allow me to pursue X, Y, Z. So even if it's a change, is there opportunity to do more with that in other areas where you're still learning? So that way, when maybe the job market gets stronger or whatever, you have that story to say, here's how I've grown. So if that's at all possible, I know that may not always be the area, but seeing, like, even in circumstances that are not ideal, what's the best you can make out of them?
I so agree with that. I think it's interesting. I think sometimes there's a bit of a maxim that floats around the, career kind of, you know, um, ecosystem, which is this idea that, every job needs to be the job of your dreams, right? And that every step is sort of somehow going to be this incredible, amazing, and it's so funny, I'm such a film nerd, and I always think about my favorite actors. I always think about the actors that I just really blow my mind. And when you look at their catalog of films, you'll always find, even among the very best, you'll find all of these examples of films that they've done that just totally bombed and were not good films, right? And so this idea that every single step needs to be kind of this ideal, perfect, I just don't agree with that. And I think in each role or each venture or project that one pursues, there will be areas of growth, and there will be areas of stretch, right? To your point, exactly. And we want to identify what those are and what we're particularly needing at that given time. So, wow, right now I really need stability from a pay perspective, but you know what? I'd really love to grow in X, right? And there'll always be things that we don't think are perfect in each role. But identifying those areas of growth and stretch, to your point, I think is crucial and can really help make the decision making process a lot easier, I think.
And I'm just looking at the time, and I want to share. Sorry, we talked about a lot. Is there anything that I missed? Like, anything that you're really passionate about that you want to share with the world?
I guess what I'm thinking about is where we're in this conversation together is I'm thinking about your listeners, and I'm thinking about that moment that we just shared where we were thinking about that person who, is maybe considering something a little risky for them, and maybe considering something that feels, you know, to the name of your podcast, off track. And I just, if I can share anything, you know, some of the biggest leaps I've ever made in my life have felt really illogical, and have been at times, got a lot of feedback from others around me that have said, "Oh no, ooh, I don't know about that. That doesn't sound right, right?" And I just strongly encourage, if you feel called to make a leap that's that means something to you, that feels part of a bigger purpose beyond the role, beyond the thing that you tell people, you blurb, you spiel. If you feel that deeply in yourself, then take the leap, do it. Whatever that is, whatever the off track idea is that you have, I would highly encourage you to do it. Because the thing that happens, right, is we know is when we make that leap, if we discover it's a mistake, if we discover it's a failure, we've lost nothing. We've just learnt something more. Like, oh, I've realized that was actually a failure, that was a mistake, and I move forward with that knowledge. But we as humans, we struggle so much with roads not taken, right?
Mm-hmm.
You never know. An example I use a lot, and this is one I'll share with you. As a kid, I really wanted to be an actor. I thought that was what I was going to do, right? I had this dream. I want to be an actor.
Yeah, I
Big,
can see
yeah,
that.
big
Anybody
fantasy of.
wants to cast Sarah? I'll give you her email. You can
If there
contact.
are any agents who are listening, please,
I
I'm
love it.
waiting for your call. So that was my dream, and what I found was that I never pursued it, and so I spent a lot of my 20s thinking about the thing I never pursued, the thing I never did, right? And so what I did is a couple of years ago, I went and took a class at one of the well-known film schools, and I took a summer series, and went and did it. And I said, I'm going to know, was acting really the thing I missed? And much to my surprise, I discovered that it absolutely wasn't the career that I was interested in at all. I remember taking these classes thinking, oh man, you got to learn all these lines, and then you'd have to audition, and you don't get any regularity. And so there was all this discovery that I had when I went, and pursued this road not taken, that I was like, oh, actually, this isn't what I need. It's a null hypothesis. And so I just think it's so important in our lives to take those leaps and risks, experiment, play, learn, right? And we might find that actually it's really not the thing that we thought it was, right? Right.
Yeah.
And that's okay too. But it actually helps us gain more insight and self-knowledge,
Yeah.
so that we can find the right thing that we really want to do.
Oh, Sarah, that was so valuable. I'm so glad I asked, and thank you so much for sharing that. It's such a great thing to let our listeners think about for themselves. Like, what is that thing that's calling them, right? And why not, right? Let's not live in regret. Or even if you did regret something, we can do now to maybe revisit it and see if it was the thing that makes you feel alive. Is it right for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So agree with that.
Well, Sarah, I want to be so appreciative of your time. This was so fun. I hope you had a great time too. We learned so much, and it just excites me that you are sharing your wisdom and skills and thinking about things in such a wholehearted way to help people and organizations. So I'm grateful for that. And how can people find you? How should people connect with you? And of course, I'll link that in our blog description, not blog, vlog description, podcast description. But how should people find you?
Yeah, so if folks want to reach out on LinkedIn, that's usually the best way to find me. And I'm really happy to chat with folks who are either in the area of learning development, thinking about change leadership, or just considering a big life change, and they're kind of wanting. I'm always one to be a champion for people taking the leap. So I'm certainly happy to support folks in that way as well.
Absolutely. And before we let you go, we just have final 3 questions. They're just like quick, on your feet, whatever comes to mind. Okay. And then
let's do it. Okay.
Ready? Okay. So first one, what motivates me the most is
connecting with people.
Success to me is
feeling a sense that we're all moving together.
And going off track is
the most wonderful adventure.
Oh, I love that. Sarah, thank you so much. This was so much fun. And for everybody listening, just share with us what you got from this, any insights, tag us on any social media. We'd love to hear what you thought of this. And thank you so much again, Sarah. This was such a pleasure for me.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Anya.
My pleasure. Take care.